Yes, good evening, and welcome again to, as Brother Halimadi would call it, your weekly Open University. My name is Adesoji Ginla, reaching you from the belly of the beast, the mother of imperialism, and as we face another conversation today, I have with me Sister Nduku and Brother Milton. Sister Nduku, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, habari gani, karibuni, asante for being here with us. Again, I am a Black African woman who is done with the system that has kept us subjugated and marginalized for years and is choosing to do something about it. As Walter Rodney says, we cannot just stick to the books and the history. We have to use the history to take action. So, yes.
Thank you, Brother Milton.
Yes. Karibuni, friends, comrades, sisters, and brothers, from wherever you're joining us today in Chuo Kikuu. Chuo Kikuu is the Kiswahili word for university, of course. Milton Alimadi, based here in the once second belly of the beast, and also now descending. And we hope that a better world will actually emerge one day as empires rise and empires decline. But the sad thing is the empires don't learn anything from the history. And that's part of today's conversation when we look into the United Nations. Back to you, comrade.
Yes, Kumbukeni, meaning remember in Kiswahili, is helping us to chart a course as to remembering the reason why we're in the pickle we are today. And the one such body to look into today would be the United Nations. Why the United Nations? Why not the United Nations? Celebrated as coming into existence in 1945, but the story of United Nations did not start in 1945. It actually started in 1939, following a conversation between Eisenhower and Prime Minister Winston Churchill. And the conversation went along the lines of, we need to find a way of not fighting each other again, but instead channeling all our strength towards, ensuring that there is peace in Europe and peace throughout the world. Yeah, peace in Europe and peace throughout the world would come up in what was then known as the Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter will give birth to the Bretton Woods Conference. The Bretton Woods Conference will then, as a result, come up with initially three bodies. First, it was the United Nations in 1945, the World Bank in 1946, the IMF 1947, the General Agreements on Trade and Tariffs, which was one of the reasons why they were fighting themselves in the first place, was to control resources. So why fight if we can have a conference? Let's talk about, not fighting. And so they came up with the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. And there is no other reason. We can't, we ended up fighting ourselves after 1919. So let's come up with a body that will ensure we do not fight by being on the same team. And hence the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, otherwise known as NATO, in 1948. But today we're talking about the organization that was created in 1945, the United Nations, which came forth, the root of which was the League of Nations. Now, what is important is not just the fact that this organization was created, but the bedrock of it was that you had the five allied, five world powers at the time. It was France, United Kingdom, France, United Kingdom, USA, China, and Russia. And so here we are today in 2023. We're looking at this organization. How has it fared? Is it, as the question asks, an agent of Western imperialism? And with me to discuss whether it is or whether it is working as intended is obviously my co-host, Brother Milton and Sister Nduku. So over to you, Sister Nduku. First thing, what is your impression of the United Nations as a body?
So as I was listening to you introduce the history of the United Nations, we're talking about them sitting, right? Churchill and Eisenhower sitting, talking about we should not attack each other anymore. How are we going to establish an entity that will ensure that we, as they're talking about we, they don't see African nations as a we, right? They're talking about themselves, which is why when they establish it, they don't consider to include any African nations in that permanent membership of the Security Council, which are the five original members, that is France, UK, USA, China, and Russia. And so from the get-go, the United Nations is built without Africa in mind as far as ownership of the entity. And it is built in a way that it's going to be telling Africa what to do and not working with Africa to figure out what to do. So for me, it is an entity that was established as a structure of the imperialist system and has maintained that system for years. We're going to get into the details. An example is the peacekeeping mission, right? It has been in Africa for years, yet there's not been peace known in Africa since it came into Africa.
Speaking on the issue of peace, Brother Milton,
yes,
would you agree that Africa is living a very peaceful existence and everything is going as planned, and in fact, Africa can be considered the Garden of Eden?
Thanks to the UN, don't forget.
Well,
yeah.
First, let's go back into parts of your introduction, comrade, and thanks for that historical summation that you always offer to begin our conversations. I think it helps the listeners a lot as well, the viewers. It's impossible to have a United Nations and imperialism at the same time. So from the get-go, it was not meant to function as United Nations. Mm-hmm. The problem was manifest during the era of the League of Nations, which, as you pointed out, preceded the United Nations. The language in the charter was, a little similar: collective security, collective development, and peace and prosperity.
Mm-hmm.
And as the sister Nduku pointed out, it was not meant for the colonized people. Back in the day, they used to call them the darker races of the world.
Vijay, the book, that's the book by Vijay Prashad.
Yeah, and conceptually, they're still seen as the darker nations of the world. So you have the same contradiction where now you're supposed to be in a much more enlightened era after going through the calamity of World War I and World War II. You now have a United Nations, which is supposed to have learned from the history. And once again, you still have imperialism at the same time. They didn't say, now that we're forming a United Nations in 1945, let's abolish all the colonies now. How can we have a United Nations while imperialism is still raging in most parts of the world? Britain still is owning all those empires. France, the same way. Belgium, Portugal,
Hmm.
And United States imperialism is also manifest in parts of Asia, in South America. So there's never really ever been a United Nations, and that's the problem. So the United Nations has been used selectively to advance imperialism. And it's not surprising because power never yields anything willingly. China, in fact, as you know, was not seated until the 1970s because of the intervention of African countries. It was previously Taiwan, the renegade part of China. It was because of the intervention of African countries in the General Assembly persistently that China finally got seated, and China is today a prominent member of the Security
Council. Yeah.
So we can point to some useful contributions that the United Nations has made. When we talk about UNESCO, for example, in preserving educational and historical sites and monuments around the world, in producing very useful literature, including the UNESCO series on African history. There you go, which is, I think, a very useful contribution to teaching African history on a global scale, because independently, Africa does not have the resource to disseminate information in the manner in which it needs to do. And of course, this is something that the African Union should own, but that's a different conversation for another day. The FAO, the
Food and Agricultural
Organization of the UN, the High Commission for Refugees. So those agencies have done, the UNDP have done some productive work. But when it comes to the issue of peacekeeping, that is where it's been used as an effective tool of imperialism, particularly by the United States. So we can start from the get-go in Congo. When Belgium undermined Congo's independence immediately after independence.
From day one.
And Congo, under Patrice Lumumba, Prime Minister, and Kasavubu, who was, not a very steady individual, the president, called for UN intervention. The UN failed the Congo. The UN failed to support the legitimate government of the Congo, which was Patrice Lumumba's democratically elected government. And had it not been for the intervention and the support of Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, as well detailed in Susan Williams' brilliant book,
White Malice,
we've spoken about many times, the Patrice Lumumba's government would have collapsed much, much earlier. He might have been killed earlier. Not that it makes a difference, because ultimately
he was killed.
Deposed and killed anyway. And the UN literally stood by and allowed him to be captured and manhandled like a common criminal and killed in the most brutal manner. When the United States realized that, the UN, because there were some oppositional forces, the commander, one of the highest officials, and I forget his name, we may look it up from the book, the Indian official, was actually very supportive. And if he had his way, the UN would have supported fully Patrice Lumumba's government and allowed it to function. But the US was pulling the strings from the background, because the US wanted to get rid of Lumumba once he was tagged as a pro-Soviet communist. And the destruction of the Congo has not yet recovered from that destruction of the 1960s. Of course, ultimately, they imposed Mobutu and sustained Mobutu until 1997. So that's one of many examples where the UN was used as a tool of US imperialism. And then the second example I would like to give is of Rwanda. Rwanda of the 1990s, when Rwanda was invaded from Uganda. The invasion force largely led by the offspring of Tutsi refugees who had fled earlier massacres in the 1950s, late 1950s, early 1960s, at the time of Rwanda's independence, when the Hutu majority seized power and they ended the monarchy. So Uganda supported an invasion. And at that time, France, another very malign imperial power in Africa, actually did one useful thing and said this should be seen as a war of aggression. There should be robust UN intervention to secure the borders and to turn this invasion back. But the US had bought on the propaganda by the Ugandan dictator, Yoweri Museveni, that this is a time to displace French-speaking influence from Rwanda and to replace it with English-speaking influence. So in other words, you US, you can spread your imperialism using Uganda as your partner. And the US bought that idea. And they refused to allow the Security Council, they vetoed it, to intervene to secure the border in 1990. It festered, it led to exacerbated hostility between Hutu and Tutsi within Rwanda. And ultimately, when that plane was shot down in 1994,
carrying Haryana, and what's the other gentleman?
And Sylvester Ntayamira.
Ntayamira.
Who was
president of Rwanda,
Burundi.
president and Burundi. One strike takes out two presidents.
Right. And of course, there have also been reports that the missile that shot down the plane was actually given to the Rwanda Patriotic Front by Uganda. And one story in the New York Times, which the US denied, was that the missile also came from US stock, right? Given to Uganda and then given to. So there are a lot of dirty hands in what ultimately resulted in the genocide in Rwanda of 1994. The UN was used in the sense that it was held back deliberately by the United States in order to accomplish the goal of spreading English-speaking imperialism instead of French imperialism.
So that would, sorry to cut you. So that will explain the reason why the commander of the mission at the time, General Charles Delem, the Canadian general, said the French were not only somewhat complicit because they seized a container of machetes, and a couple of weeks later, the machetes would then act as the weapon of choice in what would then transpire the killing of 800,000 people in 100 days. And the French who just stood by doing, the French gendarmes just stood by doing nothing. So
that part of the story actually was widely disseminated.
Yeah.
But the more tragic part of the story, which is not properly disseminated, was the Ugandan role in instigating the violence by actually being a part of the shooting down of that plane. That, as you noticed, deliberately, that story has not been fully explored in corporate media. Up to now, the UN has not conducted a thorough investigation to determine who really shot down that plane. It's primarily because the US does not want it to be investigated.
Speaking of shooting down of planes, it seems that is the go-to modus operandi for anything that those who control the United Nations do not want to see. And by that, I'm going back again in time to the shooting down of the plane of the UN Secretary General, or at least that is still being treated as an accident and an reopened accident for those who...
I don't think it's being treated as an accident anymore. I think they've acknowledged that.
No, I'm being...
Particularly after Susan Williams' book, that there is solid ground for... are you speaking facetiously?
I'm trying to be...
Okay. I think your demeanor was too serious when you said it. So it ran right over me. But you're right. But the MO, of course, because you eliminate the critical individuals. In this case, when they took Hammarskjöld out, and of course, he was also not fully under control of the United States.
Yeah.
Right? And they never take chances if you're not fully under control of the United States.
I mean, you can't be allowed to run around rogue.
Absolutely. And you're absolutely right. Had he lived, things might have transpired
exactly
in a different way in the Congo. So that is a good analogy and observation.
So yes, which then brings us forward in terms of Congo. Congo has had the longest experience in terms of peacekeeping forces on the continent. So suffice to say, their comrades might have a different take. The role of the peacekeeping force, or as some will put it, an occupational force in Congo, has played or created the right atmosphere in order for the exploitation of Congo's mineral resources, which is one of the principal reasons why they were there in the first place. And for those who are not aware, the uranium in Katanga at the time was highly sought after. And in fact, it was one of the principal reasons why Patrice Lumumba had to be taken out, because he was seen as a conduit of what will transpire, allowing the Russians to get their hands on uranium, or as they say it, what's his name, David Levin, who was the chief operation officer for the company at the time, said it is important.
And brother, elaborate for people who may not know.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay, for those who don't know what the company means, you're talking about the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. So that's the popular, that's the nickname he has. It's called the company. So, and they said it's important that we took this guy out, and because, as they put it, he was becoming too irrational for them to deal with. And what was Lumumba's point? Lumumba's point was, I just need these resources to take care of my people.
Absolutely.
There's nothing wrong with that, but
they did to Lumumba what they did to earlier to Mossadegh, Mohammed Mossadegh in Iran, and what they did to Arabs in Guatemala. The same thing. I need some of this to feed my own people.
Exactly.
And imperialism is like, how dare you?
Yes. And so all of this happened while the United States Blue Helmet, as they are called, Blue Helmet being peacekeeping forces, are on ground. The killing of Lumumba would happen while they were on ground. The takeover of Mobutu will happen while they were on ground. And so fast forward to now, even the exploitation of the local population by the so-called peacekeeping force happens while the UN is on ground.
With almost 20,000 soldiers on the ground.
On the ground, under the umbrella of the United Nations peacekeeping force. So recently, the president of Congo declared that it is time that the United Nations peacekeeping force leaves.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if we're saying leaving, would we say would we say mission accomplished, or would we say is a question of, now that we understand what has transpired in Congo, do we now need to look elsewhere with regards to the footprint of the United Nations on the continent? Sister Nduku.
I mean, let's be honest and acknowledge, first of all, that the UN peacekeeping mission has been part of the reason why there's unrest, right? They not only just stand by, but there's word that they also provide passage for opposing groups and extremist groups, and they also provide weapons for them, right? If indeed the US is as mighty as it is, and it is a permanent security member of the UN, it's the one that came up with the idea of the UN. And if indeed the peacekeeping mission has been in Congo all these years, why is there no peace? Like, we logically have to ask ourselves, if this entity is so powerful, it has modern weaponry, it can do something if it wanted to, if it actually was there to do something. Why do we still have unrest? And then now, thank God for the internet, or thank the entity that controls our existence for the internet, we get to see live videos of children and women in the Congo telling us exactly what is happening, telling us that these men and women in blue helmets are not helping us. In fact, we are running away from them. So we all have to be honest in calling out this entity that apparently is around. And we all know also the peacekeeping mission has also been a cover for the CIA for several years. So are we going to continue going along with this while we acknowledge in closed rooms that this is what's happening and not coming out saying it openly? Or are we going to call them out openly and say, you're an entity that is no longer helping us? And yes, they do need to leave Congo as soon as possible. And it is mission failed.
And Brother Milton.
Or mission accomplished, given their mission, because their mission was not peacekeeping in Africa. It was to get resources. So for them, it's mission accomplished.
Well, the mission actually, I think they're calling for them to leave because their mandate expires next year anyway.
Okay.
So either way,
we're not renewing.
Yeah, the mandate was going to expire. You know, so a number of serious questions then emerge after that. Will Congo be able to secure its borders? Because what Congo is actually facing is a low-scale war of aggression from Rwanda and Uganda, you see? And that's part of why this UN peacekeeping operation has not been allowed to function fully. Both General Kagame in Rwanda and General Museveni in Uganda serve Western interests. So by fully protecting Congo, you have to take sides. And it means you'd have to confront your own puppets, people that serve your interests. You'd have to essentially make them stop the wars of aggression on Congo. But the wars of aggression also, if you notice, the wars are conducted in areas of resource concentration, right? It's not by accident. Why does Congo not have the same problem on the other side of its border on the west? Why is it only in the east? And I actually couldn't get the link to this UN report, but I just emailed it to both of you. Not the link, the title of the report. If somebody can pull up the actual link to the report, we could post it also for our viewers. The report details and even names.
Which report are you referring to?
The UN report on resource extraction
Okay.
in the Congo. So that report names the companies that are benefiting from it, and how they're supporting Uganda and Rwanda, basically using the Ugandan and Rwandan military as their own mercenaries to cause havoc in Eastern Congo so that people are killed, people run in terror, and then when people run, their minerals are extracted. Simply because these corporations that support Uganda and Rwanda don't want to pay taxes to the central government of the Congo. So millions of Congolese can die, and then they use the media narrative, oh, this another tribal war in the Congo. Complete nonsense, of course. Yeah, tribal war that is making people multimillionaires in Europe and North America, you see? And that is part of the narrative that you never hear in the corporate media, you know? In 2013, when Obama was president, I think at one point he really got authentically annoyed at both Rwanda and Uganda. So the UN in 2013 authorized a special UN force, even though MONUSCO was already there, which is the large force.
The body, yeah.
This special force, UN force, was given attack authorization. In other words, they're not only supposed to be in a defensive position.
They could take on.
This force destroyed the so-called M23, which is just a cover for Uganda and Rwanda, within a matter of weeks, and forced them to withdraw. And that was the end of that crisis for a bit. And there was some peace in Eastern Congo, relative peace after that happened, after the defeat of Rwanda and Uganda, aka M23. Now M23 has emerged again. You know, there's no such special intervention force to defeat them. Primarily because you would have to, as I said, go head on against your two most reliable African
allies.
puppets.
Yep.
You know, and we can't call them allies. They're not big enough to be allies. Allies is when they have comparable armed forces, you know. You and I can be allies. Yeah.
Okay, so foot soldiers. They're foot soldiers.
There you go. That's the best word for it. And therein lies the problem. If we had like Congo's army is weak, so it needs outside help. Two things. Number one, if we really had an intervention force like the Cuban army, for example, this crisis would have ended a long time ago, right? We saw how Cuba helped stabilize Angola, secure its independence, kick out and defeat South Africa. You know, Cuba could do it with a few thousand disciplined, well-trained soldiers. But of course, they won't allow Cuba.
I'm glad you mentioned Cuba, Nduku Alimadi, because Cuba is a good juxtapose on against the UN peacekeeping mission, right? If Cuba could do it with just the limited amount of resources that they had, why has the UN not been able to do it?
With a budget of $1 billion every year. Think about that.
Yeah.
$1 billion every year. You could have used maybe 10% of that to train an efficient Congolese army to secure its borders and use the rest of the money for economic development in Congo.
So, speaking of economic development.
But sorry, let me finish this thought.
Okay.
And it just came to mind as I'm speaking it. There are vested interests when you're spending $1 billion.
Exactly.
You know, a lot of people are getting a cut of that. The primary beneficiaries of $1 billion are not the Congolese. So now it takes us to a discussion we had many weeks ago or months ago when we were discussing the World Bank and its role in Africa. And we said the vested interest, the people whose salaries are paid, right? And for them, success is defined in a very different way. Think about it. If MONUSCO had succeeded 10 years ago, how many people would have lost jobs and incomes over the last 10 years? So it makes sense that the vested interests that actually don't want MONUSCO to succeed.
Exactly.
So that they can keep renewing that mandate. At the end of the day, it goes back to resources, outside people benefiting from the suffering and the death of African people.
Adesoji, before you move on to your next question, it also goes back again to who are the entities who are sitting saying we're coming together to put this body together to ensure our peace, our economic progress, and all the other things that is under the Charter of the United Nations. And Africa, when it first starts, is not a part of that. So it makes sense that those countries are the ones that have good economies, and Africa does not have good economy because they have been keeping peace for those entities in the Security Council this whole time. Anyway, Adesoji.
Oh, yes. Okay. So you spoke of interest and economic interest. And I want to then say, okay, in terms of economic interest, where the economic interest of the global powers that sit within the UN have been challenged. I'll give you an example. In Zimbabwe, when the land was redistributed, one weapon of choice was used: sanctions.
Yes.
Right.
And we've seen how the sanctions panned out. So are we not right in suggesting that, yes, the UN's very body has been used as this vehicle of Western foreign policy decisions? Because if you can use that vehicle to impose sanctions, I mean, majority of those that impose the sanction are one within the Security Council, Britain and the United Kingdom, Britain and the United States, and supported by the EU, of course. African countries are on powerless to push up against it, basically destroying the economy simply because Zimbabwe was seeking to write a different chapter of what its history should look like. So if you guys will speak to the notion that sanctions have not been used, where, as far as I'm concerned, in righting a wrong, but actually being used to punish the victim of historical injustices, Zimbabwe being a key point. Because first, the land was stolen from the people. That was an injustice in itself. They get independence, flag independence, decided, you know what, we're going to use this flag independence to seek our own self-agency. And then instead of being allowed to get on with it, the second injustice is visited on them, which you also then bring about the third injustice. But before we go on to the third injustice, let's talk about the notion that sanctions was used to bring Zimbabwe to heel.
Well,
go on.
I'm not sure if there are UN sanctions on Zimbabwe, but I know there's US.
They approve it though.
Yes,
yeah.
but in a way,
and EU sanctions.
Yes, but so I'm saying, just using the inverted logic of what Fela sang in his album in 1996, where he says "Beast of No Nations," and he ascribes the notion of having a United Nations, and yet it is same within the same United Nations that you have all these bodies that are visiting vitriol on each other. So I'm using that logic to say within the United Nations, you have these same Western bodies that should be working towards world peace and global stability that are also then using...
For Europeans.
Yes.
So as far as they're concerned, they are working for world peace.
Which is why I said before, mission accomplished in Congo. But Adesoji, finish that, because I am eagerly waiting for you to finish the question.
So my question is, are we not sitting and, visualizing hypocrisy of the highest order when you have...
I think what, I would argue that it shows how the other members of the UN are very weak relative to the United States and its Western allies in not being able to effectively counter the sanctions. When a few countries decide to go rogue and impose illegal sanctions that are not within the purview of the United Nations. The United Nations is incapable of doing anything to counteract that. I mean, look at, Zimbabwe, of course, is a calamity, but look at even Cuba, an illegal sanction that's lasted for 60 years. And here's the thing that they can do, because they're so powerful and they control so many institutions. The impact of US sanctions has impact on your dealing with other countries, see, even if they don't have sanctions. So, for example, the US could say, we have sanctions on Cuba. So therefore, any European or African or other corporation that continues to do business with Cuba cannot do business with US corporations. So something like that. Think about that. How preposterous it is. So it has cascading effect and impact. And that's the problem with the sanction. And sanction, as you know, is part of an arsenal of declaration of war. So as you pointed out, they declared war on Zimbabwe for returning the land to the descendants from whose ancestors the land had been stolen in the first place. So that, was seen as a crime by the powers that be. And Zimbabwe has paid the price for it since the land reform, and it still continues to pay the price. But it just also is a testament to the resilience of the people of Zimbabwe, that it's not completely collapsed. It just goes to the resilience, actually, of African people, the remarkable resilience to be able to find ways to continue to exist. That is admirable. But of course, the sanctions should be lifted. Sanctions against all the countries should be lifted, even with countries that you have ideological disagreements with. And then finally, you notice that the sanctions are not imposed, are mostly not imposed on European countries. Exactly. And that is also an issue that we need to discuss.
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah, Sister Nduku, you wanted to say
so
something?
here's my frustration, and I was actually jumping on YouTube to get a link for the People's Tribunal meetings that have been going on that just ended.
Which I testified, by the way.
When I heard a Ugandan person, I knew it was you. When I heard that description, I was like, okay, Alimadi, that's who they're talking about. But this is my frustration when we have these types of conversations. It sounds like we are all talking about a rotten egg and whether we should cook with it or not, or throw it in the garbage, right? To me, that's how I see the United Nations. These nations have been known as reformists. They've called themselves reformists for years, and I think it's time for a reform. Anything that was established and brought about in the absence of Africa, now that we know that Africa is a part of the global of the globe, and now that we know African resources and African people are important, they keep talking about, now you hear all these wazungus on TV talking about how important Africa is, how wonderful Kenya is. Oh, this is the best place we ever found, and it's the future. If we are indeed the future, let's get rid of all the structures that you established without Africa present, and let's put in new structures. That, for me, that's it. There's no sitting and talking about whether this rotten egg, can we cook this part? Is it good a little bit? Or it has so much bad about it. No, the UN is a rotten egg and it needs to be thrown in the garbage. And then we need to find out what we're going to cook next.
I think this is my own take. I think we are putting the cart in front of the horse. And this is what I mean. Nothing is going to reform the UN until we reform the governments in African countries. Because they will not make the demand that is necessary. But if we had revolutionary governments in African countries, first of all, they would have a foundation to make the demand that we either make the UN a UN for everybody, or we have so much resources under our control that we can invite other major countries to explore how to create an authentic United Nations. You see? But that won't happen unless we have governments in African countries that are of the Thomas Sankara mindset. If all of them were like that, they might say, here are our demands. we must have seat on the Security Council. All these other UN agencies must reflect the world community, not the US, Western Europe. And sometimes because China's the power now, they can get officials at the right place too. But you have to have that demand. And if that demand is not met, then we're in a position to start withdrawing from these agencies and having meetings to create a new United Nations for all. And the US can apply just like any other country, right?
Exactly.
Britain can apply, France can apply.
There's no applying.
The credentials are checked. No, I mean,
even the idea of applying does not. Sorry, Brother Alimadi. Even the idea of applying.
No, because you apply
does not.
No, let me finish this time. You apply, meaning you're going to have to agree to abide by the constitution
that makes sense. Yes.
Of this new United Nations. You can't come with your same imperialist
mindset,
and think you can shot.
Exactly. I agree with that.
And that's what we need to do. But first, we have to secure power in Africa, which we don't have, and that is the major problem. That's why we can't do anything about the World Bank, can't do anything about the IMF, we can't do anything about
all the entities, the World Trade Organization,
which, as we discussed in our previous show, allows Europe and the United States to subsidize the farmers, but bans Africans from subsidizing farmers. That's why you have the humiliation of so-called presidents running to tidy Ukraine, asking for food. Let's think about that. Running to Russia, asking for food.
Well, they sell their African land to Saudis to produce food. The irony of it and just the frustration of the stupidity of it is just.
We need to maximize the pressure that we put on these so-called presidents, who are really some of the biggest enemies of African people.
Go on, I said
go on.
For me, here's the thing, right? We keep talking. We know the problem is at the top. The issue is at the top. We know that top needs to be taken off. And then we, the bottom, need to stand up and do something about our lifestyles. So we're talking about the masses in Africa. When we get on this platform and we say share, 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 for those of you who are in Africa who have access, for those of you who have, I grew up in Africa, so I know these little towns that have kiosks. There's a kiosk where there's a projector, someone owns a projector. Have these shows that are giving this political awareness. Expose it to the members of the community. I see those communities. I know when you call them in for an event, they will show up. Tell them this is an event to educate them about what is the cause, the true cause of their heightened increased taxes, the true cause of the lack of food, the true cause of the lack of agricultural structures that can help them have sustainable agriculture that will provide them food. We need to stop joking. This is not about getting subscriptions on YouTube. This is about getting the information to the masses. And then to the masses who get the information, it's about you rising up and stopping. We all have to stop to waiting for these people who we know are clearly not looking out for our interests to give us solutions. We have to be the ones who come to them and say, you're fired. We're going to put in a new structure.
So what I like is that even though the ongoing transformations that are occurring in West Africa, they're the initial stages of transformation. There are going to be challenges, but I think those leaders, such as the ones in Mali, for example, Burkina Faso, Niger, they should move a little more quickly on the issue of having a common political agenda. And this has always been our failure. Everybody likes being a leader. Nobody wants to yield sovereignty. Because if they don't, eventually they will snuff out this transformation, ongoing transformation. Already in Burkina Faso, they're having challenges. There are still elements within the military who want to go back to the good old days in their mind, right? So there's no guarantee that Traore, the current military ruler, will have time to transform that society. Obviously, the French are working with reactionary forces
tirelessly
to eliminate him, to reverse things in Burkina Faso, to reverse things in Niger, to reverse things in Mali. So they're in a unique position, and these kind of opportunities don't come by often. They need to move, I think, quicker. They spoke about a political federation. I know it's really hard to execute it because we've become so used to the names of our tiny individual countries,
Right?
it's your country, it's your apartment, it's your little studio apartment or one bedroom apartment, you hold on so dearly to it, but if they don't do that, I don't see that they have the capacity to withstand the reactionaries. But if they were to succeed, it would put pressure on other African countries because young people all over Africa are watching carefully. They're frustrated by the knowledge that we sit on the world's richest, yet at the same time, we are the most impoverished people. See?
So, yes, you mentioned, to take you back a bit, you mentioned the issue of reform. And again, Kumbukeni is all about remembering. So we should remember that on October 4, 1984, someone said, we also propose that the structures of the UN be rethought and that we put a stop to that scandal known as the right of veto. Does anyone know who said this?
Only Sankara could have said something like that.
To say.
That was Thomas
I
Sankara.
was about to
Yeah.
say.
On the floor of the
that was a smart young African man.
on the floor of the
Brave, not only smart, but brave.
on the floor of the
Fearless.
United Nations.
Fearless. In
And
fact, the U.S. Because they'd invited him to meet Ronald Reagan, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
But the U.S. embassy said, "We need to read your speech that you're going to
Imagine
deliver
that.
to the UN first
Mhm.
to consolidate that invitation." He said,
Imagine
"No, nobody reads my speech in advance."
And still,
And he went to Harlem on top of that. He didn't just say
Instead,
no. He went
to Harlem. He said, "Harlem is my White House."
Still in that vein, in that same paragraph, he said, it is true that the pernicious effect of its misuse have been mitigated by the vigilance of some of those who hold a veto. However, nothing justifies a right, neither the size of the country that holds it nor their wealth. And so we should, as much as possible and as quickly as possible, do away with the veto power. Effectively, he's asking for reform. Now, there is one other thing.
Let me just before you continue.
But even to give
not gonna
clarity,
interrupt for
Alimadi, the veto power, provide who,
the veto
explain
power,
who, yeah, please.
which of course is in the hands of the five big countries.
Only the 5 year. Thank you.
Yeah, Soviet Union, China, U.S., Britain, and France.
Mhm.
But the point I wanted to interject before you continue, brother, was that the veto power did not help Libya in 2011.
That was actually where I was going next.
Okay.
But go on.
When both China and Russia
pushed
abstained.
that.
Not just, and Germany abstained as well. But you're right, they're not a member of the council. But go on.
Yeah, Germany doesn't have veto power. But had China vetoed, we won't have the ongoing jihadist, so-called jihadist war that we have today in West and North Africa. We would not, because the jihadist war started after 2011 with the collapse of the Libyan state and the proliferation of the most sophisticated weapons that Gaddafi had. Gaddafi had weapons. That's why he actually survived war with NATO for 9 months. Think about that. All he lacked was anti-aircraft, effective anti-aircraft missiles. Otherwise, NATO would not have been able to defeat him.
But that also goes to the idea of an African Union. Gaddafi is, again, protecting that apartment that he has. His might be a bigger one. He has a penthouse in New York in the name of Libya. And instead of him equipping all of Africa, I mean, I also can see that Gaddafi is looking at these other neo-colonialist leaders. He cannot trust them, so he cannot, there's a lot.
But he gave them money. He gave them a lot
right?
of money.
Africa is a very, very nuanced subject.
Ultimately, he was taken out because he was pushing hard for an African federated union for the continent, and much more importantly, and much more dangerous for France, he was about to support the creation of a new African currency backed with $8 billion of Libyan gold. And that would have been only the beginning, because Libya, in its sovereign fund, had more than $100 billion. By the way, who knows what happened to some of this money? I mean, a lot of it is still there, but billions are also missing. But that's for another discussion.
Okay, so you mentioned a name there, Reagan. Now, what is Reagan, making the grade with regards to the UN? Reagan will also stop a quote unquote, as he used him, a dangerous radical from becoming the first African Secretary General, Salim Ahmed Salim, who would have gone on, because he's campaigning then, and I remember because my dad kept clippings, was the fact that he said the UN as it currently sits needs reform. And so all of his going to Europe to canvass and everything, he got everybody on side. But when he came to the United States, Reagan made sure keep that radical African away from the UN. And he said he vetoed the guy's candidature. That's how, what's his name? Javier Perez de Cuellar became Secretary General instead of him. It will only be late 90s where Boutros Ghali, the Egyptian, will become the Secretary General. And even then he was just, essentially, he was...
Right. Talking about U.S. presidents, let me just a minor diversion. At one point, I was reading a lot of the old Nixon papers, right? When they transcribed some of those, recordings where I was speaking very openly. There was one.
I would love those if you still have them. Please send over to me. But go on, brother.
Oh, I think they're available online, actually.
Okay.
But at one point, he was talking with Kissinger, and he was talking about, Idi Amin. I think they were talking about, whether he eats people or what, that kind of stuff, and what the U.S., because Amin had just kicked out. First, they kicked out the Asian community that had British passports, and then he kicked out the British. So there was the British were trying to get the U.S. to consider an intervention, I think. But the U.S., thankfully was not interested in supporting any military operation. But then, as an aside, Nixon said, he gets tired of having to meet all these African ambassadors when they present their credentials. But this is what he said, and you'll support him on this.
They love Nigerians.
No, he said, why don't they unite and just have one, can you be like, even Nixon is seeing
in their arrogance, they usually,
for a very different reason, right? Advocating united Africa, in his case, so that he would only have to meet
one person. In his selfishness, he gave the answer and we didn't even listen.
No, which is,
I found that so ironic. That you have Nixon calling for united Africa for a different reason, albeit, right?
Speaking of united, or shall we say his humanitarian grounds for wishing that
I'm glad
Africa does unite. Do you see the influence of the United Nations on humanitarian grounds on the African continent? And if you don't, what would it look like if that was supposed to be the case?
So, for me, if the United Nations was actually an entity that was protecting human rights, right? The US should be sanctioned for like forever, until from back when until now. They should be sanctioned. The UK should be sanctioned. France should be sanctioned. China should be sanctioned, and Russia is sanctioned. All the members of the Security Councils should be under sanction right now if the UN truly was an entity that was enforcing its charter, because they have all violated its charter. So again, for me, and I'll let Alimadi speak, this is a non-conversation. Let's throw the rotten egg in the garbage and let's figure out what we're going to cook next. Alimadi.
All right. First of all, on the issue of humanitarianism, and that is also, tragically, the narrative that has been, perpetuated since the demonization of African peoples to justify enslavement, colonialism, and now neo-colonialism. There should not be any humanitarian role for the UN in Africa, because Africa should not be dependent. And that is a problem. Mm-hmm. So now we see part of the symptoms of dependency as actually an issue. So we need intervention to help Africa through this crisis. Well, why are they through this crisis? They're through this crisis because they don't get their full income. If you have an employee and the employee, if the going rate is $40 an hour or $20 an hour, you're paying that employee who is entitled to the $20, $1 an hour. That employee will develop all these other maladies that the employee should not have had that employee not
getting the right value
of the $19. And that is what's happening to every African country.
Okay.
So you sell your very valuable resources for cheap. You buy manufactures for very expensive. And the World Bank says you cannot manufacture domestically because the money we're lending you, you're not allowed to build factories. So then you need intervention because you have all these crises. Then the UN sends peacekeeping troops.
I think
everybody else gets a salary, even though they created
them because the World Bank falls under them. So they have created them.
Of course.
Because I think
look at the other hypocrisy. Why are UN humanitarian employees not on the US border helping all those thousands of people who are stranded in the border?
Thank you.
Some are in very bad conditions, including children. Why aren't the UN providing housing to the ones that have made it to New York City? So the UN, because the US is not projected as a country
struggling,
where the UN should also play a role in humanitarian crises. See, the humanitarian crisis is meant for countries like the ones
that have been
Africa.
Deemed as less than. Okay. I mean,
quickly also, Adesoji, just to add to Alimadi and talking about the within the borders of the US and the UN not doing anything about that, right? Humanitarian efforts. I recently visited, and there are many cities in the US, predominantly Black, with Black residents, predominantly African Black residents, where this is happening. But I visited St. Louis recently, and I literally had my mouth open the whole time as we were driving by. It was hard to see a home that was not boarded. like intention. And you know this is intentional for those of you who've read The Color of Law and many other books, that the government, the private entities and interests do this intentionally to run down a community so that they can devalue it, purchase it at that low value, rebuild it, and then sell it for a higher value to a certain
market,
Holland. Right?
Look at Holland.
And what is the UN doing about that? Nothing. What is the UN doing about the homelessness in the US that is so... Nothing. What is the UN doing about the police shootings in the US? Nothing. So for the UN to come up with the US being a member of the Security Council, the UN is not holding them accountable. This is what I'm saying in short.
Now we are getting into the nitty-gritty.
This is what I'm saying in short. The UN looks perfect on paper, but it does not have a strategy to enforce its charter with the different entities. And the US should have been taken off the Security Council many years ago, and all the others, because of the violations of that charter.
And as I said earlier, nothing will happen unless we change our own governments.
True.
Unless we keep demanding to have the Sankaras of the world. As you read that speech, I highly recommend people go and read his speech at the United Nations. I think every time he spoke, he made sure he presented knowledge, because as far as you were concerned, that might be the last day.
Did you say Sankara or Guevara?
Sankara.
Okay. Yeah.
Sankara knew, ultimately you could tell that he knew that he had a short time on this earth. And he tried to impart all the knowledge that he thought he could in the few years that he had on this earth.
Because funny you mentioned that. If you read his speeches in Sankara Speaks.
Yes. Did you put that book in the resource also?
Yeah.
That's
did I? Book. I'm not sure I did. Did I? But I could put it in there.
Yes.
Every time, if you read those speeches, it is almost like you're getting a lecture. And a lecture that you can build upon. That speech he delivered October 4, 1984, which he opens by saying, I come to you from a country of 8 million people, men, women, and children, who have refused to live with hunger, thirst, and death. And I've come here to tell you why we've chosen to revolt. He's essentially putting you on notice that whatever you see in Burkina Faso from now on is justifiable response to what the experience is. So when I mentioned humanitarian intervention, that was what I was referring to, because one of his first interaction was actually with a UN agency. He said, show me an example of one success story in Africa. And when they couldn't, he asked them to leave. So when Brother Milton was mentioning earlier that until the African leaders find their voices, question would be, this sort of matter will continue, because if every leader were to ask the UN to leave, and well, hopefully you leave, but you have a plan in place, because Sankara had a plan and he executed on his plan. If you ask them to leave and then you execute on your plan, they have no excuse to be there. So maybe you actually have to intervene humanitarianly on your own behalf. Maybe, as they say, charity begins at home. Maybe you start the rebirth.
If I'm to give them advice, I would say, if you want the first major fight, start with the World Bank. Because once you're in control of your production, you're in a much, much better position to engage in the other fights. I would start by really going hard against the World Bank, even before
and the
other institutions like the UN.
Yeah,
I think the World Bank and IMF are much more destructive to the well-being of African countries, and that's not analyzed carefully. Yes, the UN failure to protect people in Eastern Congo, that is a calamity. It is outrageous. It's ugly, but it's sadly nothing compared to the destruction of the IMF and the World Bank. We spoke of an example where was it Malawi's Minister of Finance, being told you have to
destroy your food
stock before we give you a loan?
Mm-hmm.
What kind of criminal does something like that, right? You're not supposed to subsidize farmers so that you can be food dependent. And when Sankara defied that and made his people food self-sufficient within 3 years, the target on his back just became, bigger. Can you imagine if every African country was food self-sufficient?
Yep.
That's the beginning of the end.
Of course.
But the problem is, you go around hungry, meaning it's easier for your own misruler to control you, right? Now you're fighting, how can I better myself against my own misruler? So it's difficult for you to have time to think about the global war.
The global enemy. Yes.
That you also need to be engaged in. You need to be engaged in both fights, at the same time. And I've said this before many times. I always support my sisters and brothers when they invite me to participate in protests, whether in person or digitally, against AFRICOM in Africa, against US bases in Africa. But I say we need to put as much energy and determination in fighting the World Bank and the IMF.
Speaking of those two bodies, it's also, it's worthy to say that wherever their destruction lies is usually where you will see the UN. So they're
all part of the same compound. No, you're right. They're all part of the same.
So there's a symbiotic relationship there. It's like, don't worry, I'll be right behind you. I'll be right behind you.
When you see the establishment, they were all created at the same time.
Right.
Adesoji.
Look, if you want any, and we've discussed this example in the past, if you want any proof that things can change, look at China. Look at China. China is the best manifest. Look at Cuba. Cuba, even with all the crises that Cuba has, Cuba is governed much more efficiently than many African countries that are resource endowed, right? Because even though they don't have resources, they're much more in control of the decisions that they make on a daily basis. And that makes a difference.
True.
When you wake up and you say, today I'm going to do A, B, C, D in order to accomplish this. Cuba is engaged in that. How many African countries are engaged in that?
But also,
go ahead.
Go on.
Now, I gave the example one of our earlier shows, where this professor, Congolese from Congo, Brazzaville, professor at Harvard, was telling me in his conversations with other African presidents who told him how the Western ambassadors accredited to their countries come to lecture the African so-called presidents in their office. You must do this, you must do this, you must
Imagine
do this.
that.
Otherwise, this is going to happen. Think about that.
That's friendly. That's friendly advice.
Listen, there's a reason why I'm not an ambassador, because and I would probably be fired the next day if they select me as an ambassador. But the other thing too, Adesoji, as you speak of Sankara, and the reason why frustration continues in Africa for those of us who are awakening from the stupor of colonialism, mental colonialism especially, is an African did it. Like, we don't even need to talk about, do you have solutions? Why don't we study Sankara? No, I'm talking about government. See what he had in place, the actions he took, and just replicate.
I support that 100%. We need to have,
because it worked for them,
a symposium on Sankara. I would fully endorse that. We've discussed a couple of ideas to put on talks. I think we should do one just on Sankara and have people present papers on Sankara and Sankaraism and its benefits. And I think that would get wide support. That's something I think we should do.
I am open for that conversation. Actually, looking at the documents he and his government put together, the steps they took, and the actions that worked for them, I am up for that.
Yes, because ultimately we need something that is also identifiable, that our young people can relate to. And our young people already relate to Sankara, but they're not fully informed of how much Sankara they actually still don't know. You see, they know the Sankara, the rebel, right, who stood up for the dignity of African peoples, but the programs that he had in place, we need to find a way to disseminate this to our young people and get them even much more dedicated in getting rid of the misrulers.
And also, and I think if they were to become conversant with what he stood for, his programs, his thought process, he should actually be spoken of in the same breath as Kwame Nkrumah.
Absolutely.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, because
Absolutely.
When in researching this program, I was going through his book, Sankara Speaks, amongst many, all of which I've put in the chat for people to, if you want an insight into the the actions of the United Nations in Africa since pre-60s, pre-60s, mid-60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, up to the very point we're talking about, 2023. Some of those books actually capture them, and all their agencies with regards to what they try, how they carry themselves forth. But I would especially recommend this book by Sankara. Sankara Speaks.
As you speak of that, no pun intended, as you speak of that, it also reminds me, as we talk about the UN and the interconnectedness of the imperialist system, the private entities, right? And you're mentioning, as we do our research, as I was doing my research, looking through Patrice Lumumba and the UN's standing by while everything happened and watching him be killed, while they're there, he called them there to help. Patrice Lumumba reached out to the UN to come and help. And instead of helping, they provided the perfect environment for what happened to happen by standing by, right? And as I'm doing that research, I come about a gentleman. His name was Frank. I forget the last name, Italian last name. Not that it matters whether it was Italian or not, but he was a CIA undercover. And that gentleman, after all
Carlucci.
Carlucci, he went on, get this, to be the chairman of the Carlyle Group, a private entity that has business all over the globe, including Africa. This is what we're talking about. CIA agents and spies end up running the companies that are making money and taking resources out of Africa. The conflict of interest.
Oh, with them, there's no conflict.
There's no conflict.
Right?
There's acting
of
as
our
intended.
interests, we the masses.
Our interest, yes.
Of our
Not
interest.
their interest.
The conflict of interest, of our interest, is just astounding. And we are just sitting and watching, what is going on. Let us pray. This is another thing in Africa. Let us pray. We're going to have prayer sessions for this to end.
We can't exactly say people should not have a faith process. Even the church would say, now that you've finished praying, now go out and
exactly. If
do
you
the
pray
right.
all week and then on Friday you go to the streets, I'm good with that.
So it's part and parcel of the thing. What I would say is, speaking to the role of the United Nations within Africa, Nkrumah was right when he said Africa should unite or perish.
Yep.
And one of the problems he faced in helping Patrice Lumumba navigate the place that is Congo, and also the issue of the international politics world, is the fact that sometimes you have to know when you're beaten. And not just say, okay, fine, I'm beaten, and I just start throwing out everything, but also to be strategic. It's the reason why Nkrumah was able to write 17 or so books, because he was thinking. And they know the more they allow him to think, the more he will ask. Exactly.
An
They know
African
the more,
brain is
the more they allow him to think, the more they allow him to put his thoughts on paper, the more they're going to have a problem on their hands. So when the chance came for them, February 24, for them to get rid of him, 1966, they, and they had to do it when he was out of the country. They couldn't do it while he was around.
Africa must awaken.
So again, so although Ghana did not have a peacekeeping force as the case would be, we also have to understand that just like we talked about the Organization of African Unity last week, the UN, we have to essentially say, you know what, like the proverbial orange, take out your nutrients and let the rest be. Prior to starting the program, we were talking about, looking at the organization as a whole. Are we going to totally condemn the organization? Is the question. If we don't totally condemn the organization, what part of the organization do you, as my comrades, look at and say, yes, okay, I'm willing to work with this one? Over to you guys.
I'm not even entertaining that. To me, I'm not going to call it nonsense, which I was about to do because my brother is about to make a case for it. So I don't want to indict Alimadi before he speaks by calling it nonsense. But for me, again, like I said, I used the rotten egg before, but now I'm going to talk about foundational structure, right? If you have a building whose foundational structure is flawed, you will take down the whole thing and start over. We've learned lessons from what caused that foundational structures and making sure you do not repeat those mistakes. The UN was formed with only 5 nations in mind, and the well-being and the success and the growth of only 5 nations in mind. And while they built it, they were exploiting Africa. And they had just sat down to figure out how they could continue doing that, not too long before that. So in essence, as they talk about this, they were still okay with the exploitation of Africa and the draining of Africa. So for me, it needs to be thrown in the garbage. The UN needs to be abolished today. Where's my right eye and my left eye? We have seen, you were talking before about Alimadi, if we take them out of Congo, how is Congo going to handle Rwanda and Uganda? Congo has not been able to handle Rwanda and Uganda, even with the UN there. So it makes no difference. That's the thing. For me, this question, and I think Walter is the one who warns against this, Baba Walter Rodney. He says we're too caught up with this question of what are we going to do then? How about we just kick them out and then we figure out what we're going to do? Because we realize that their existence within us, it does not work. This question of what are you going to do then? Stop asking that. Kick them out. Brother Limaji.
Right, so I think, as I said in the beginning, if we don't reform our leaders, we will never be able to reform any one of these institutions, the UN, the World Bank, IMF. There's no need singling any one of them. All of them are meant to keep Africa dependent and weak as part of the global system, because in order for the global system to benefit and transfer wealth from one part of the globe to another, you need to have those parts weak and dependent. So the UNs, the IMF, the World Bank, they're not in the business of making you another potential competitor in the global economy. That will never happen. But part of the problem is because we are so weak and so dependent, we actually can't throw them out today or tomorrow. So, for example, the UN agencies are feeding people that should be growing their own food. In almost every African country, there's a UN agency engaged in feeding. So by throwing them out today, we would be condemning millions of our own sisters and brothers to death, unfortunately. The same thing applies to, as I said, UNESCO. This is something where African Union should have stepped up a long time ago. We haven't done that. And then in terms of the peacekeeping.
Why UNESCO though?
No, because we need education. Without that, let me finish this stuff. Without that book, African Series,
They are miseducating us.
They're
The
not
education is
miseducating
not
us. The
benefiting
UNESCO
us.
book is unique in that we published a book that informed the world of an aspect of African history, which is not being taught. It was done through UNESCO. The book he's holding in his hand. That book was not published by Heinemann. It was not published by
I
African
think this
University.
is a strategy of imperialists, though, to do small good deeds.
Sister, I'll let you speak.
Go on.
You know?
Yeah.
So if we focus our energy on changing the leadership and we get many Sankaras, not only would we be able to change the UN, we'll also be able to change the World Bank, we'll be able to change the IMF, we'll be able to change the World Trade Organization. And Africa will finally realize independence for the first time. Because at the end of the day, the story we're talking about is Africa's lack of independence. African countries are independent on paper alone. All these outside entities, including the UN, has more power than the individual governments in African countries. And that is why sovereignty in Africa means nothing. And that's why I contrasted the actions of the UN in African countries as opposed to in the United States, where right now they actually should be engaged in providing relief to those people that are coming in through the southern borders. I rest my case.
The reason I raised up the UNESCO book is it's one in a series of 8. Actually, a series of 9. 9. The first one was to tell us how we used to document our own history. Oral, which is what we're doing right now. We spoke to ourselves in the circle. 2 was to tell you in the beginning, this is what we encountered. And then it comes forward. This was the last in the series that was written by edited by late Professor Ali Maizuri. The beautiful thing about it is this. It might be dated now, but believe you me, there is no compendium of its like on African history. None. And the different thing about it was the fact that it was not only compiled and edited by distinguished scholars, Africans. Ali Maizuri is just one of them. Adubuahen. I'm looking at
no excuse why African Union cannot do an
continue exactly.
But
cannot carry out an updated version of it.
But first of all, African countries are not even making their annual contribution to the African Union. And that's why 60% of the budget comes from outside Africa. You see, we have so many domestic contradictions that are holding us back. At the end of the day, if we don't deal with the domestic contradictions first, we will just keep talking theory, how to get rid of these outside entities.
So for me, here's the thing, and it's all good that they supported this book, right? But this is the same thing as them giving us aid. They keep doing these things to keep us happy so that we do not rise against them. This book is currently on Amazon going for $305.82 hardcover and $654.98 paperback. So much for them supporting a book if they're not making it accessible to the people.
If you go onto the UNESCO website,
still.
No,
let me make my point. No,
okay.
Still, I'm not done making my point. Again,
go ahead.
I'm not done making my point. They are people who we've seen records of them saying Africans don't read. So of course they'll allow a book because in their minds, Africans don't read. So they know it's not going to awaken Africans.
All right, so comrade, I was actually going to suggest that maybe before we run out of time, we get some quotes also from the audience, unless we're not going to do that tonight.
Yes. I was going to bring in, there was one I saw earlier. Let me see. Okay, yeah.
You see that one?
Yeah, so Karen, that's a catch-22. How do you build what is needed to feed yourself and stop receiving aid if a condition of that aid is that you do not do what is needed to feed yourself? Okay, well, here's the thing. I will give a take before my colleagues do. With regards to the question of aid and food subsidies, we have to understand that with the way the economic system is skewed, places like all places on the African continent have arable land. So let's not just say places, but the countries are still they're still surviving on the old exports to eat model, which is they're producing what they don't need to buy what they do need, which is logic on its head, but somehow they've made it work or not work. And so that's why you get the added cushy aid from time to time with all these so-called powers. Over to you, Sister Nduku.
I think, Karen, I don't think you can build that, right? Because it's defeating itself. As you first of all, they're not allowing you to build, so you cannot build a way to feed yourself. Because again, we have mentioned the IMF is putting that as a condition for this aid. So in order for you to get aid, it is stopping you from doing the things that you can do to make yourself stand on your own 2 feet. If I was making a decision for my family today, and that was the case, I would say today, all right, guys, we're going to have to eat skuma all week. That is colored greens all week, which is what a lot of Kenyans are doing today because they cannot afford food. You eat ugali and skuma, which is a cheap meal, cornmeal cake, kind of cake form made with cornmeal and colored greens. They eat that all the time. Let's eat that for a while. Take this person out of our family that is causing this stagnation of progress, and go through a few months, a few years of struggle while we rebuild, like Sankara did. Because we keep asking this question as if it wasn't done. Again, I'm saying Sankara did it. What did he do? His people clearly had to go through a time of strain before they got to progress. So why don't we do that?
So you are, to Karen's question, you have to have a plan to phase out for every aspect of your economy. So food, of course, is one of them. In the case of Burkina Faso, Sankara said, no, I don't want physical food deliveries. We need seeds. We need tractors. We need weeders.
Thank you.
And within 3 years, they were able to have, they had land reform, of course, which is very important as well. Land reform. You can't be having your government selling land to so-called foreign investors who are funded by the World Bank,
which is happening in Kenya. Yep.
Off their land. So it can be done. You weed it out. You, at some point, of course, you have to refuse aid that comes in the form of food. You need to produce your own food. But if Burkina Faso is able to do it in 3 years, it means other African countries can do the same.
Thank you, brother.
Yes. This referring, what's his name?
The Ali Mazrui edited book.
Yeah. So no, not just Ali Mazrui, it's all the books. I'm still of
the opinion. In fact, one of the best essays was by Cheikh Anta Diop. I forget which series. I think it might be in the second.
I think it's the second one. It's in the second one. Where he was talking about.
Right.
The God King Darrell made that statement. The books were written by Africans, as you were speaking about Ali Mazrui and the many editions of the book that were written. And that the fact that, was it UNESCO supported it or whoever it is?
Yeah. Okay. So the reason I actually brought it up again is the fact that at the time that these books were written, the majority of the funding actually came from Africa. Okay. And the reason I mentioned that is just when that book came out, there was also another series that was done on what's it called? That was done on bear me a second. That was done on the Nigerian Television Authority. This one, The Africans, by Ali Mazuri.
Although that one, if they never did it, I wouldn't miss it too much.
Yeah, I know. But
compared to the
compared to the books,
the UNESCO thing.
Yeah. So the reason I mentioned that one is the fact that it's also a very, very good. I mean, it's how many series? Is 13 episodes. It's a very good entry point into understanding the history of Africa. No complete, a bit washed down, but it's still an entry point. And what's funny about it was sponsored by the Nigerian Television Authority when BBC and the CBS pulled funding. So it's an example of what Africans can do when they really put their mind to it. So that's why I pulled up this episode.
And not so much when they put their mind to it, when we make them, put their mind, because every African government has a budget for the military, has a budget for the state house. We did the other show the other day. I was telling you how Dictator Museveni has like 400 servants or somebody.
Can you imagine that?
How much of that money could be put in producing, these kind of books, So it's up to us really to light the fire beneath their feet, all of them.
Okay. So final words, comrades.
Well, I think every show that we have done so far shows the necessity for us to really do our best to get rid of the managers of the affairs of imperialism, who are the people who are misruling Africa. And I keep bringing this because it's one of the best lectures. Crisis in the Periphery. I think I bring it up in every show.
By Brother Walter Rodney.
And the Caribbean, where he said that independence was, yes, significant and historical, but it was not sufficient. It opened the door for opportunities. The opportunity must be putting in place governments that are of the people, by the people, for the people in African countries. Then we can really start chatting. We've not engaged in any fight for 60 years because we have not had governments that are dedicated to engaging the fight. If we had dedicated governments, do you think Africa would still be not industrialized? Think about that. China did it. Yeah. China did it in our lifetime. Think about it. Not Sister Nduku, you're a bit younger, but China did it. No, really. It's practically in our lifetime. China did it. So it means Africa can do it. But you have to, as I gave the example of Cuba, you be in charge of making decisions, whether they're correct decisions or wrong decisions, but you be in charge, not being pulled by puppet masters.
And Sister Nduku?
So for me, as we continue to organize and find solutions for Africa, first of all, I want a change now. So I'm not one who's going to sit and wait for you all to read and become smart and aware and decolonize your minds. I want change now. So how am I going to inspire that change? We need to have political awareness in the masses. The masses, my mother, my brothers, the people in the village in Kikoko, in small villages in Luoland, in Uganda, in South Africa. Those people need to be aware about what the true cause of, and I'm seeing that awareness in videos from Congo, right? The true cause. I was listening yesterday. I put the People's Tribunal link there. I was listening yesterday to a gentleman from Palestine. I forget his name. And he was like, you all need to go watch that video. He basically said, action now. It has to be action. And he gave multiple examples of the only time that the US and the imperialist nations have pulled back on their actions. And it took action for the people. Now, I don't know how we're going to strategize to organize that. But what I'm saying, in the meantime, as we do that, I am awakening my African brothers and sisters. Tomorrow and every Monday, we will have a session where we read this book, which is one of the awakening books. So if you have a phone, if you have a projector in Africa that can get access to the masses, please tune in with the community. In Kikoko, invite the villagers in the store, in one of the stores, project this session as we continue to learn so that they too can hear. That's my last word.
Actually, brother, I'm very sorry. Can I interrupt you? I actually have to update people on my book, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, go on. Yeah.
All right. So I know some people have posted in the back that they have a copy of my book, Manufacturing Hate, How Africa Was Demonized in Western Media. So this book, previously I had a self-published version called The Hearts of Darkness, How White Writers Created the Racist Image of Africa. Then through the years, I did more research. I updated it. I think it's much better edited now. And the structural organization is much better as well. So in 2021, I found a publisher. Publisher is called Kendall Hunt Publishing Company. Kendall Hunt. And in the beginning, the book was moving well. And I know it was moving well because I was getting decent royalty checks from the publisher. In the last year, there's been a major problem. People are not able to get the book. People order the book on Amazon, and it may take as many as 6 months. Some people have ordered it many months ago and don't have it yet. Now, in the beginning of the semester, I told my students to get copies from the publisher's website. It was one of my students who informed me that from the publisher's website, you can only get the digital version now. My publisher was no longer making the physical book available without my knowledge. It took a student in one of my classes to inform me, the author. So needless to say, I've demanded to get my copyright back so that I can make this book available. I was telling comrades that when I used to go to do readings in churches, for example, in one reading alone, I would sell up to $600 worth of books. Because the book really addresses how major publications, including like New York Times, were not only covering Africa in a racist way, particularly in the 1960s, but actually concocted things that did not even happen in African countries to give it a racist, tribalistic image.
Yeah.
And I think, I have no evidence, of course, but I suspect that there are powers that be that don't want this book to be widely available. It doesn't make sense to me that a publisher would not want to sell books. Why are you in the business of publishing? So to cut a long story short, I'm creating a GoFundMe campaign so that I can raise funds to buy the copyright back. The publisher has told me that in order to get my copyright back for my book, I need to pay them $3,000. So, comrades, sisters, and brothers, if you're listening, at some point, please go to GoFundMe. By tomorrow, I would have the campaign up. Also, you can send me an email so that I can send you the link. And my email, we'll post it on the chat, is malimadi, which is my last name, of course, @gmail.com. So that if many of you, some of you that have read the book and can support us in getting this widely disseminated, spread the word about the GoFundMe so that I can get my copyright back from Kendall Hunt Publishing Company and make this book widely available. So I wanted to bring that up as well. Thank you.
So share that link so that we can share it every time we go on air. And tomorrow when I'm reading the book, I'll share it as well.
That's
absolutely.
So that's an act of revolutionary in itself. Reading is a revolutionary act, as they say. Yes, I was going to say two things really. First being the fact that yes, this book needs to be widely disseminated. I mean, I've read it. I'm looking at my copy there. You probably won't be able to read any text in there because it's been written all over. Because I was questioning the audacity of what the author was saying. And
were you questioning him or the people, the stories he was telling?
Actually, a comrade, one of my students, came back and showed me her copy. She has written more words on her copy.
Yeah, I mean, you should see my
the
copy.
text that I have.
You should see my copy. My copy was like, surely, no, I mean, you're making
I
stuff
actually
up
got
now.
an idea, but I'll talk to you off camera on it.
Yeah.
Go on, Adesoji.
So there is that. Please do support the GoFundMe to get the book beyond the present. And sometimes,
and we'll keep track of them if they change that 3,000 to another number that's higher.
Actually, thank you. I printed it out.
We have all. Yep.
I printed out the email they sent me, and
so they want to check.
They're not incapable of doing something like that. You're right.
Okay. Hopefully, are they taking cents, nickel and dimes? I
offered 500. They rejected that. They said, no, we want 3K.
Okay. So, yes, as we just spoke about the United Nations and whether it's a tool of imperialism within Africa. The reason why we had to engage with that organization is because sometimes we lack the imagination to think beyond what is possible. As Aiku Yama would say in his book, Remembering a Dismembered Continent, he said what Brother Milton often points down to is our leaders are unable to think beyond their little. They rather be the minister of nothing than being the, than being part of something. And so maybe, hopefully, someone can share this conversation we have and help them to understand that oftentimes it's, it's much more better to be part of something than being the leader of nothing. And so, yes, ladies, brothers, sisters, family, do join us next week as we continue the conversation. And see you all till then, as we say in my language, Yoruba, which is Ekudede Woyi, and Odigbakono, which is see you later.
Yes.
Oh, I forgot my cue. Sorry.